Snow seals the cabins to their roofs. The first storm of 1846 hits and doesn't let go. Inside, families simmer rawhide just to survive. Outside, the pass is gone. Nothing but white and wind. By spring, rescuers will learn what hunger left behind. This is the Donner Party.
What you are about to hear is believed to be real, based on witness accounts, testimonies, and public record. This is terrifying and true.
Before we sink our teeth into tonight's terrifying and true, I want to say a huge thank you to our sponsor, Savorista Coffee. When you're a coffee lover that doesn't want to stay up all night, at least not from the caffeine, Savorista has you covered with half-calf and decaf options that are bold and flavorful. And if you head to Savorista.com right now and use promo code SPOOKY at checkout, my listeners get 25% off your first order. And every purchase directly supports the show, so head to Savorista.com and type in promo code SPOOKY. Tonight, winter slams shut on the Sierra Nevada, and an American dream turns feral. It's 1846. Lured by the Hastings Cutoff, families reach Truckee, or Donner Lake, on October 31st. By November 4th, a blizzard seals the pass. Cabins vanish under the snow. Meat is all but gone. Rawhide boils while the wind screams, and people begin to die. Desperate, a group of them known as the Forlorn Hope step into the white on December 16th, sporting crude improvised snowshoes. Rescuers later fight 30-foot snowdrifts and stumble onto the scene, a scene they'll never forget. Tonight we explore human choices in impossible cold. This is the stark truth of the Donner Party. In the spring of 1846, nearly 90 American pioneers, men, women, and children, set out in covered wagons from Springfield, Illinois, bound for the fertile promise of California. They were ordinary families chasing an American dream of new land and a better life, a part of the great overland migration sweeping the 1840s. Among them were George Donner, a 60-year-old farmer leading his family west, and James Reed, a prosperous 45-year-old businessman with a young family. They joined a larger wagon train on the now infamous Oregon Trail, full of optimism as they rolled out of Independence, Missouri, in May. The journey was arduous but familiar. Follow the wagon-rutted trail across prairies and over the Continental Divide before winter. Through the early months, the Donner and Reed families enjoyed the adventure. 12-year-old Virginia Reed later recalled riding her pony across the Platte River Valley, gathering wildflowers by day and singing around campfires at night. By summer, the wagon train had made steady progress into what is now Wyoming, reaching Fort Laramie. Spirits were high. To one traveler, The endless plains and towering Rockies beyond felt like entering a new world, full of wonder. Yet ominous signs of trouble lay ahead on the unmapped frontier. As the group pressed on toward the Continental Divide, they faced a fateful decision. A self-styled trail guide named Lansford W. Hastings was promoting a new shortcut route to California that year. Hastings claimed his Hastings Cutoff could save hundreds of miles by veering south of the usual trail. On July 12th, the Donner Party received a letter from Hastings urging them to take his new trail and warning of difficulties ahead on the old route. At Fort Bridger, a remote trading post in Wyoming, the party had to choose: stick to the proven path north via Fort Hall, or gamble on Hastings' untested cutoff through Utah's unmapped wilds. In a cruel and tragic turn of events, Hastings had never actually taken wagons over his own shortcut. Unbeknownst to the emigrants, he was using them as guinea pigs. Jim Bridger, the fort's proprietor, had financial interest in the new route and downplayed its risks, even hiding letters from earlier travelers that warned the cutoff was impassable. Persuaded by Hastings' glowing promises and Bridger's assurances, the Donner Party elected to try the shortcut on July 31st. It was a decision that would doom them. Almost immediately, the Hastings Cutoff proved far more difficult than advertised. The trail west of Fort Bridger vanished into a maze of canyons and mountains. Hastings himself had ridden out ahead, guiding another group, leaving only handwritten notes tacked to trees for those behind. One such note told the Donner Party to wait for Hastings to show them a better path. James Reed rode ahead with two others and caught up to Hastings, only to have him point vaguely toward a dauntingly high ridge as the way forward. The shortcut led the wagons into the rugged Wasatch Mountains of Utah, forcing the emigrants to literally carve a road as they went. Progress slowed to a crawl, sometimes only 1.5 miles per day. As all able-bodied men hacked through the dense brush, felled trees, and heaved rocks to clear a passage. Precious weeks ticked by while the party labored through the Wasatch Range's tortuous canyons. When the exhausted families emerged from the mountains, they faced the next ordeal: the Great Salt Lake Desert. In late August, they found another tattered note from Hastings, warning of a stretch ahead with 2 days of difficult travel, with no water or even grass. In reality, the barren salt flats were far wider than Hastings admitted. The Donner Party pressed into the White Desert, hoping to cross in 48 hours. It took 5 hellish days. Blistering sun by day and freezing cold by night tortured them on the Alkali Plain. Thirst-crazed oxen collapsed in their yokes. Some wagons had to be abandoned mid-desert, left to sink in the salt. 9 of James Reed's 10 oxen ran off into the mirages, maddened with thirst. Cattle and horses died or vanished by the dozen. When emigrants finally staggered to the next water source, they were battered, demoralized, and nearly out of supplies. Any faith in Hastings' easy route had evaporated. Their shortcut had become a devastating detour. By the time the Donner Party straggled out of the desert and rejoined the main California Trail near the Humboldt River on September 26th, they had lost at least a month of time. Winter was closing in, and they still faced 300-plus miles and the Sierra Nevada ahead. Quote, "Never take no cutoffs and hurry along as fast as you can," young Virginia Reed would later implore to others, a hard lesson wrung from bitter experience. Now dangerously behind schedule, the party hurried along the Humboldt River in present-day Nevada. The strain of the journey began to unravel the group's unity. Food was running low, and tempers flared. Along the Humboldt, an elderly Belgian immigrant named Hardcoop was forced out of a wagon by the hard-edged Lewis Keseberg, told to walk or die. Soon, Hardcoop, his feet swollen and bleeding, fell behind and was left sitting by a stream, never to be seen again. The others, desperate to save themselves, refused to turn back for the old man. It was a chilling abandonment, a sign of vanishing social order. Other human decencies soon gave way to suspicion and violence. One day in early October, as tensions spiked, James Reed quarreled with a teamster, John Snyder, who was savagely beating Reed's oxen. When Snyder turned his whip on Reed, Reed stabbed him in the chest with a knife, killing him in front of the train. The only law on the trail was the emigrant's own, and the wagon company meted out judgment. Some cried for Reed's hanging on the spot. In the end, they decided on exile. Reed was banished, forced to ride ahead alone in the wilderness without his family. Reed's wife and children, now without their patriarch, continued onward in the Donner Party's care, a fragile arrangement as food grew scarce. Meanwhile, rumors of murder swirled. A traveler named Wolfinger had lagged behind to cache his wagon, accompanied by 2 acquaintances. Those men returned alone, claiming Paiute warriors had killed Wolfinger. But months later, one would confess on his deathbed that Wolfinger had been murdered for his money by his own companions. Such was the breakdown of trust. Even before reaching the Sierra, comrades had turned on each other for survival and greed. By late October, the Donners, Reeds, Graves, Breen, and other families trudged on with whatever oxen remained, nervously eyeing the looming Sierra Nevada ahead. The air was cooling. The nights grew bitter. Winter was on the doorstep. At last, on October 31st, 1846, the Donner Party reached the foot of the Sierra Nevada at Truckee Lake, which now is known as Donner Lake, terribly late in the season. A few sparse cabins built by earlier travelers stood near the lake at 6,000 feet elevation. If the party could cross the high pass just a few miles beyond, they would descend to the safety of California's Bear Valley. They attempted the ascent immediately, only to be met by a sudden, blinding blizzard. An 8-day snowstorm blew in and buried the mountains in deep snow, blocking the trail. The emigrants with wagons and exhausted oxen could not break through the snowpack. After several desperate tries, they had to turn back to the lake. Winter had trapped them. It was November 4th and snow already lay 5 to 10 feet deep in some drifts, a harbinger of the brutal months to come. The party hunkered down by Truckee Lake to wait out the winter, utterly unprepared for what lay ahead. They hastily built camp, 3 primitive cabins of pine logs with dirt floors and thin canvas or oxhide roofs. Holes in the walls served as doors. One cabin was occupied by the Breen family, another by the Eddies and Murphys, the third by the Reeds and Graves. Lewis Keseberg cobbled together a lean-to against the Breen cabin for his family. 5 miles back at Alder Creek, the Donner families, who had fallen behind, set up a separate camp, fashioning tents out of wagon covers. Even as they built these shelters, snow continued to dump relentlessly, towering higher with each storm. Before long, the cabins were buried to their roofs. To enter or exit, the emigrants had to dig tunnels through snow or climb out of holes in the drift. The world became silent and white. Outside was a frozen wasteland of drifts. Inside the dark, smoky shanties, hunger and fear set in. Game was non-existent. The deep snow had driven off any deer. Within a few weeks, all of the oxen and horses were slaughtered for food. They butchered the animals and rationed out thin strips of beef, trying to make the meat last. There was no salt or seasoning. They even tore apart their wagons for firewood, burning everything that could possibly feed a flame. Children went to bed crying in hunger. Mothers grew gaunt and hollow-eyed, unable to feed their babies. As November passed into December, meat ran out. The only food left was what one man grimly referred to as poor beef without bread or salt, and soon, not even that. Snowstorms pummeled the lake camp one after another. By mid-December, snow lay 8 to 10 feet deep around Truckee Lake. It was, in the words of one survivor's letter, the camp of death. The emigrants were starving, entombed in snow and utterly isolated. Weeks had passed with no word from the outside world. With no reason to believe help would come, they began to consider unthinkably desperate measures. Inside the cabins, the pioneers began to eat anything remotely edible. They boiled strips of leather, oxhide strips, shoe leather, even boiled cowhide rugs into a glue-like soup to gag down. They gnawed on bones and bark. Mice were caught and eaten, Candles made of tallow were consumed when nothing else was left. In his diary, Patrick Breen described these, quote, hungry times in camp. On January 17, 1847, he noted that, quote, provisions scarce, hides are the only article we depend on, and prayed, quote, may God send us help. By that point, rawhide strips simmered into a foul jelly was truly all they had. Breen recorded that one neighbor, Mrs. Elizabeth Graves, had plenty of boiled hides but, quote, refused to give any to Mrs. Reed, even when Reed's 4 young children were on the brink of starvation. Charity was dying, along with hope. Frigid weather and malnutrition took their toll. Deaths became frequent. One by one, weakened emigrants succumbed to starvation and illness. The first to die at the lake camp was 60-year-old Bayless Williams in mid-December. Others soon followed: Franklin Graves, Lavina Murphy's little son, and more. The living had no strength to bury the dead in the frozen earth. Instead, corpses were dragged into the snow and lightly covered. All around the cabins were the loosely buried bodies of those who had been friends and fellow travelers. Imagine the psychological horror of that scene. The survivors could see where the bodies lay under the snow, grim mounds that tempted and repelled them in equal measure. Isolation preyed on their minds, trapped in cramped, filthy shelters, gnawing on boiled hide strips. Some pioneers fell into despair and delirium. Patrick Breen wrote on Christmas Eve that the prospect is appalling, though he still hoped Almighty God would deliver them. Christmas Day came and went without celebration, as there was nothing to celebrate. New Year 1847 dawned bleakly. Breen noted that, quote, we pray the God of mercy to deliver us from our present calamity. Still, the snow fell, and no help came. Inside one cabin, 15-year-old Mary Graves watched her mother and siblings slowly waste away. Years later, she described how the cries of hungry children tortured the parents, who could do nothing but whisper comforting lies that food would come tomorrow. In another cabin, Lewis Keseberg's wife gave birth prematurely. The infant died, mercifully spared from this world. Antonio, a young vaquero traveling with the Reeds, died of malnutrition. Franklin Graves, the family patriarch who had helped build the cabins, lay down and never woke. With each death, the survivors confronted an unthinkable question that had been approaching for weeks. Would they eat the bodies of their dead to survive? Patrick Breen's diary entry of January 26, 1847 hints at the desperate, dark atmosphere. Quote, people are getting weak, living on short allowance of hides, he wrote. Peggy, his wife, very uneasy for fear we shall all perish with hunger. By early February, Even the boiled hides were nearly gone. Quote, "Our hides are nearly all eat up," Breen recorded on February 10th. Starvation loomed. It was around this time that some of the emigrants began to talk openly of cannibalism. Breen noted on February 15th that Mrs. Graves not only hoarded her hides, but she refused to let Mrs. Reed have any, and even stashed rawhide strips on her roof to keep them from others. Self-preservation had overridden community. Each family now looked out for itself. Dignity, morality, humanity, all were in deadly peril, as much as the people themselves. Unbeknownst to those huddled at Truckee Lake, a brave subset of their party had already made the awful choice to survive at any cost. Back in mid-December, with food almost gone, 15 of the strongest emigrants, 10 men and 5 women, had snowshoed out in a desperate bid to find help. This party, later dubbed the Forlorn Hope, included Mary Graves, her newlywed sister Sarah Fosdick, William Eddy, the pregnant Isabella Breen, and others. They fashioned crude snowshoes from oxbows and rawhide and set off on December 16th over the pass. They had no real option. It was escape or die in camp. The Forlorn Hope soon found themselves in an almost unimaginable hellscape atop the Sierras. The snowdrifts rose up to 30 and 50 feet in places. The air was thin and frigid. The sun's glare off endless snowfields burned their eyes blind. Stumbling over the high pass, they became lost in deep mountain wilderness. Within days, their meager rations were gone, and they began to collapse from hunger and exhaustion. One by one, members of the Forlorn Hope dropped dead from cold and starvation. The survivors, driven mad with hunger, faced the ultimate taboo. Around Christmas, they set aside their revulsion and consumed the flesh of their fallen companions in order to stay alive. Mary Graves later recounted cutting up the bodies of her own father and brother after their deaths with numb horror. They dried strips of human flesh in the sun in order to preserve them. As Patrick Breen would later write in his diary about the scene, quote, "The Donners told the California folks that they commenced to eat the dead people once all else was gone." The act of cannibalism gave the snowshoe survivors a brief strength to continue, but it also broke something inside them. Shortly after, one member, William Foster, proposed an even worse crime, killing the 2 native guides who had accompanied them from California, Luis and Salvador, for food. These Miwok men, employed by John Sutter, had been helping the party, but they refused to partake in cannibalism. When they learned the others were contemplating murdering them, they quietly slipped away into the woods, horrified. For days, the 7 remaining emigrants staggered on, when another man, Jay Fosdick, died at night. The survivors cut and ate him too. After more agonizing days with nothing else to eat, they came across the two Miwok guides, Luis and Salvador, who were they themselves on the brink of starvation after 9 days alone. In a moment of human darkness, on January 9th, William Foster raised his rifle and shot both Luis and Salvador in cold blood. The others butchered the bodies and consumed their flesh, committing outright murder as well as cannibalism for survival. The killing of the Miwok men was not even hidden or punished later. As one historian noted, Foster, quote, was not greatly blamed for it, a grim reflection of the 1840s attitude that Native American lives seemed to matter little. Such was the moral collapse wrought by desperation as well as prejudice. In a tragic irony, Miwok villagers ultimately saved the Forlorn Hope. On January 12, 1847, the half-dead survivors stumbled into a native camp in the foothills. The indigenous people recoiled at the sight of these gaunt specters. The pioneers were so ragged and frostbitten that the Miwok initially fled, thinking they were evil spirits. Gaining compassion, the villagers cautiously approached again and offered the starving strangers some food. Acorns, pine nuts, grass, whatever they had. This simple charity likely saved the last 7 of the Forlorn Hope. Mary Graves, William Eddy, and the others owed their lives to the very people one of their party had slain. On January 17th, rescuers guided by the Miwok found the emaciated Forlorn Hope survivors and helped carry them to a ranch in California. It had taken 33 ghastly days, but against all odds, they made it out. And now, at last, the alarm was raised. The rest of the Donner Party was still trapped in those mountains, if any of them were even alive. News of the starving emigrants in the mountains spread rapidly through the settlements of Northern California. Though it was the dead of winter and the nation was at war with Mexico, several rescue parties formed to save the Donner Party. The first relief group, 7 hardy frontiersmen, set out from Sutter's Fort on February 4th, 1847. They struggled through rain-swollen rivers and chest-deep snows. 2 men turned back, but the rest pushed on. Climbing the snow-choked pass was arduous. In places, drifts had reached over 30 feet tall, and the rescuers themselves were near collapse. On February 18th, 1847, the first relief finally crested what is now known as Donner Pass and approached the camps at Truckee Lake. What they found defied belief. As the rescuers neared the cabins, they began shouting and were met with eerie silence at first. Finally, a gaunt woman emerged from a hole in the snow. It was Mrs. Lavina Murphy, so skeletal and ragged that the men were taken aback. Staring at the strangers, her first words were recorded as, quote, "Are you the men from California, or do you come from heaven?" To the dying survivors, the relief party must indeed have looked like angels or apparitions. When the rescuers began distributing food, they had to do so in very small portions, for the emigrants were so starved that a normal meal could kill them by refeeding shock. All around the cabins were buried in snow. The stench of decomposed hides and filth was overpowering. Inside one cabin, the men saw human remains, evidence that cannibalism had already occurred at Truckee Lake. 13 people had died and lay in makeshift graves in the snow near the cabins. Many of the survivors were mentally unstable, blankly stammering or weeping. The Murphy children told rescuers how their mother had been boiling oxhide into a disgusting jelly to feed them. Tamsin Donner, still stranded at Alder Creek with her husband, had carefully maintained an illusion for her little girls, telling them the boiled hides were milk porridge so they would eat it without crying. The rescuers urgently tried to lead as many survivors as possible back over the pass. 23 weak and skeletal people left with the first relief, including the Reed children and the Donner girls. But many others were too feeble to travel. About 21 people remained at Truckee Lake Camp, and another dozen at Alder Creek with the Donners. Knowing more help was behind them, the first relief promised to return and hurried back down the mountain with their charges. Tragically, even this salvation was perilous. Several of those being rescued died on their way out, too far gone to recover. Among them was William Hook, a 12-year-old who overeagerly ate too much and died on the trail. The others struggled down, half-conscious and snowblind. The Reed children, saved by their father's return, had survived without ever resorting to cannibalism. As Virginia Reed proudly noted, hers was the, quote, only family that did not eat human flesh. In early March, a second relief expedition led by none other than James Reed himself finally arrived at the camps. Reed had raised funds and volunteers in California after fighting off sickness and even joining a battle in the Mexican-American War, and now charged into the mountains to save his family. Reed found that many survivors had descended further into desperation during the interim. Human remains were found in the cabins, confirming that those left behind had eaten the dead. Indeed, on February 26th, Patrick Breen noted matter-of-factly in his diary, quote, "The Donners told the California folks that they commenced to eat the dead people 4 days ago." At the Alder Creek camp, George Donner was dying from an infected wound, and Tamsin Donner was tending to him faithfully. She could have left with Reed's party, but refused to abandon her husband in his final hours. Reed evacuated his own wife, Margaret, and their children, along with many others, 17 people in all. The March trek down was catastrophic. Caught in yet another blizzard, Reed's second relief became scattered in what became called Starved Camp. A group of refugees was accidentally left behind in the snow, mostly children. When Reed realized not all had kept up, it was too late to turn back. 14 people, including 5 children, were stranded, left in the storm with only 2 of Reed's men, Charles Cady and Charles Stone, to help them. Those 2 men soon abandoned the children to save themselves, each carrying 1 child and leaving the rest. The little ones were found huddled in the open, half frozen, eating tattered rawhide strips from a rescuer's snowshoe fringe to survive. It was an appalling scene of neglect and misery. Then occurred one of the truly heroic moments of the tragedy. A third relief party, including a large, strong settler named John Stark, arrived at Starved Camp in mid-March. Stark discovered 9 children and 2 women, barely alive, abandoned in the snow. The other rescuers with him were inclined to each grab a single child and retreat, possibly leaving the rest to die. Stark flatly refused. In an extraordinary act of compassion and strength, he carried the starving children, 2 at a time, on his back, shuttling back and forth, determined to take everyone to safety. It was painfully slow, and he was a giant in strength by one account. But all 9 children survived, thanks to Stark's resolve. One rescued child later credited the deliverance to, quote, "nobody but God and Stark and the Virgin Mary." Such a display of selflessness and courage stands in stark contrast to the horrors surrounding the Donner Party. In that moment, John Stark single-handedly kept the flicker of humanity alive. By April of 1847, more than 4 months after the party became snowbound, a 4th and final relief mission braved the mountains. These last rescuers arrived at the camps to a grisly tableau. At Truckee Lake, only 1 man was found alive. Lewis Keseberg, lying amidst the remains of his former companions. The rescuers recoiled at the sight of half-consumed bodies and severed limbs scattered around the cabin where Keseberg lay. They discovered a pot filled with boiled human flesh on the fire. Keseberg, gaunt and wild-eyed with an injured leg, had been completely alone, literally living on human flesh for weeks. He had also gathered up gold coins and jewelry belonging to the Donners. Enraged, the rescuers threatened to lynch Keseberg on the spot for murdering Tamsin Donner and others. Keseberg swore he had not killed anyone, insisting Tamsin had arrived at his camp after her husband died, only to expire naturally overnight. He admitted he had cashed some of the Donner's money at her request in order to deliver to her surviving children. Whether or not this was true, the men found his story suspicious, but in the end, they spared his life and brought him down the mountain. the last survivor of the Donner Party. Of the 87 men, women, and children who had been snowbound in the Sierra, only 48 survived to reach California. Almost half the party had perished, most from starvation and exposure. The survivors were primarily women and children, among them all 7 of the Breen children, all 4 of the Reed children, and all 3 of George Donner's little girls. The Reed family remarkably suffered no fatalities. Margaret Reed had kept her children alive without cannibalism until James Reed's return. The Donner family, tragically, was devastated. George and Tamsin Donner both died in the mountains, leaving their orphaned daughters to be raised by relatives. When the story of the Donner Party's ordeal hit newspapers in June and July of 1847, it shocked the nation. Sensational reports focused on cannibalism and alleged murders. One newspaper described Keseberg as a ghoul who relished human liver and accused him of killing Tamsin Donner for food. In California, Lewis Keseberg became a pariah, widely reviled as a bloodthirsty cannibal. He actually filed a defamation suit against one of the rescuers for their accusations. A court later found no proof of murder, awarding him a token $1 in damages. And even one of Donner's daughters, Eliza Donner Houghton, defended Keseberg's actions as driven simply by necessity, but not evil. Yet Keseberg lived under a shadow for the rest of his life, shunned as the man who ate human flesh and, quote, liked it. History perhaps unfairly cast him as the villain of the tale. In truth, virtually all the survivors, except the Reed family and a few others, had eaten the dead to survive. As historian George Stewart wrote in Ordeal by Hunger, none of them, not even Keseberg, could be morally condemned for that final resort, quote, for it was the result of necessity, under extreme duress. It is telling that no charges were ever brought against any Donner Party survivor for cannibalism or violence. The world understood on some level that these ordinary people had been driven beyond the bounds of sanity by hunger and fear. Public reaction to the Donner Party was a mix of horror and grim fascination. The incident quickly became legend, a cautionary tale about the dangers of westward migration. It did not, however, stop the wagon trains. The California Trail only grew busier in subsequent years, though no emigrant ever dared take the Hastings Cutoff again. In fact, the Donner disaster likely saved later lives by starkly illustrating the importance of sticking to known trails and hurrying along to beat the snow. Emigrant guidebooks thereafter all warned of the fate that befell the Donner Reed Party. In the aftermath, the survivors tried to put their shattered lives back together. Virginia Reed later wrote to her cousin, quote, "Thank God we have got through, and we have got through with our lives." She ended her letter with the hard-earned advice, quote, "Never take no cutoffs and hurry along as fast as you can." Virginia and the Reed family settled in San Jose, California, and went on to prosper. Their terrible winter becoming just one chapter in a long life. The Breen family also survived intact, all 9 of them. Little Isabella Breen, an infant during the ordeal, lived to be 90 years old, the last survivor of the Donner Party, passing away in 1935. Many of the orphans were adopted by California families. The legacy of trauma, however, lingered. The survivors had faced unspeakable choices that haunted them in nightmares. Years afterward, Mary Graves, who had eaten human flesh out on the Forlorn Hope trek, wrote, quote, "I often dream of the dead. They do not disturb me as they used to. The experience marked them forever." Today, a stone monument stands at Donner Lake, its pedestal base 22 feet high, the height of the snowpack that terrible winter. Nearby tree stumps cut by the emigrants at head height above the ground, visible once the snow melted, silently testify to the depths of the snow and desperation of that camp. The very landscape bears their story. Historians have identified the shallow graves, the campsite, even recovered physical artifacts like bones with cut marks. The tale of the Donner Party endures as the most haunting episode in the history of the westward migration. A story of ordinary people driven to extraordinary extremes. What makes the Donner Party story so terrifying is not just the cannibalism, but the slow unraveling of all moral certainties. These were devout, hard-working Americans, people with children who believed in God and civilization. In the span of just a few months, they went from singing hymns around campfires to considering murder for a few strips of flesh. As Patrick Breen wrote on February 26, 1847, quote, "Hungry times in camp. Mrs. Murphy said here yesterday that she thought she would commence on Milt and eat him. I don't think she has done so yet. It is distressing." The very fact that such words appear in a pioneer's diary chills the soul. Mrs. Murphy was a widow and mother. Hunger had pushed her to the verge of killing a young man for food. This is the true horror of the Donner Party, the way desperation can erode the bonds of kinship and conscience, and yet, remarkably, even in this horror, we find acts of tremendous bravery and decency. Mrs. Murphy did not ultimately harm Milton Elliot. The rescue parties did not abandon the most hopeless, and people like John Stark emerged as heroes. The Donner tragedy forces us to ask how thin the line is between civilization and savagery, and it shows that even in humanity's darkest hours, light and virtue can flicker back to life. In the end, the Donner Party story is terrifying and true in equal measure. It's a cautionary saga of hubris, taking an unproven shortcut, and of nature's unforgiving power. It's a tale of human beings pushed to the brink, confronting the prospect appalling of their own extinction. We remember the Donner Party for the cannibalism, but we should also remember it for the courage of those who endured and for the lessons their experience taught. As survivor Virginia Reed reflected years later, quote, "I have not written you half of the trouble. Thank God we are alive. Her family's salvation came at a terrible price. The loss of friends, the loss of innocence. But they did survive, as did nearly half of those snowbound emigrants. So when we think of the Donner Party, we should look beyond the gruesome headlines of cannibalism. We should picture families huddled together in the dark, a mother giving the last scrap of dried hide to her crying child, a father saying prayers over the body of a child he couldn't save. Picture the moment when rescue finally arrived, the gaunt figures emerging into the blinding light, weeping with relief. The story of the Donner Party is a human story, not a horror movie. It is about ordinary people facing the unendurable. In that, it speaks to the depths of human endurance and the will to live. As the snow thawed in the spring of 1847, the pass opened and the tragedy in those mountains came to an end. But the tale of the Donner Party remains evergreen in American memory, a testament to the extraordinary resilience of the human spirit. Terrifying and true indeed, the Donner Party's ordeal reminds us that under extreme conditions, moral norms can crumble, yet even then, acts of love and sacrifice can shine through. It's a story we recoil from, yet we cannot forget it. And when future pioneers headed west, they heeded the Donner Party's legacy. Never delay, never stray from the path, and never underestimate the wilderness. Terrifying and True is narrated by Enrique Couto. It's executive produced by Rob Fields and Bobbletopia.com. And produced by Dan Wilder. With original theme music by Ray Mattis. If you have a story you think we should cover on Terrifying and True, send us an email at weeklyspooky@gmail.com. And if you want to support us for as little as $1 a month, go to weeklyspooky.com/join. Your support for as little as $1 a month keeps the show going. And speaking of, I want to say an extra special thank you to our Patreon podcast boosters, folks who pay a little bit more to hear their name at the end of the show. And they are Johnny Nix, Kate and Lulu, Jessica Fuller, Mike Eschewey, Jenny Green, Amber Hansford, Karen Wiemet, Jack Kerr, and Craig Cohen. Thank you all so much, and thank you for listening. We'll see you all right here next time on Terrifying and True.